What a pleasure to be here with you once again, Viet. We have met once in DC, and that was a really wonderful conversation. So I am going to start by asking you a very simple question. First time in Tbilisi, Georgia?
Absolutely the first time. And it is such a pleasure to be here with you at the Zeg Festival with everybody else as well.
First impressions?
First impressions, I think it's so interesting to be in a country that to me still has all these traces of supposedly Cold War history that seem to be there in the landscape and reminds me a little bit of Vietnam, where I was born as well. So I like to see that connection that between these two seemingly disparate countries that have been joined inadvertently by the history of conflict and global struggle.
The title of this session, as defined by the marvelous curators of these 3 days, is Against Innocence. And when I read that, the first thing I thought about was that in a few days' time in the United States, there will be an enormous party to mark the 250th anniversary of the United States independence from Great Britain. And given that you have talked about yourself as somebody who was born in Vietnam but made in America, and that so much of your work deals with the contradiction that is America. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, I'm sure, in detail. But I wonder first if we could get your reflections on that birthday.
So I was born in Vietnam, but I came to the United States as a refugee from the American War in Vietnam. My family happened to be on the losing side of that conflict. And we arrived in the United States in 1975, and 1976 was the bicentennial, 200 years after the founding of the country. And so for me, coming as a refugee to the United States, I was always aware of the mythologies that defined the country, the narratives that Americans took for granted about American exceptionalism and the power of the United States. But to me, it always seemed like a spectacle because if when I arrived in the United States and the bicentennial was being celebrated, it had Americans dressed in their revolutionary garb and wearing the wigs and the celebration of George Washington and the founding fathers. And I thought, this is ridiculous. To me, this it was a costume drama. And somehow I was supposed to assimilate into this as a Vietnamese refugee. And I had no choice really in doing that. So I was raised with this American mythology, raised with a Pledge of Allegiance, raised with this idea that we Vietnamese had been rescued by the United States. And of course, we were rescued, but as I've said oftentimes before, we wouldn't have needed to be rescued if we hadn't been invaded by the United States in the first place. And so Americans really love the rescue part of the story, and they don't like to think about the invasion part of the story. And so to me, that is a part of the American contradiction. Americans, like pretty much every people, like to focus only on the positive part of their narratives and their stories. And it's the outsiders who come in and are capable of seeing the outside of that story, are capable of understanding what the contradiction that is so fundamental to the country is.
Do you feel that in this current moment that there really isn't a sense of attempting to come to terms with the fact that there is both beauty and brutality that has existed in American history, that the promise of democracy is somehow the only thing that Americans focus on, that in a way the innocence that they love to embrace doesn't allow them, it makes them blind in some ways to the idea that the founding stories of the United States are two pretty brutal things that happened, both the genocide of the Native Americans and the slavery that lasted for so long, for 200 years. I mean, I wonder whether you think there are strains of discourse in the United States that are actually attempting to look at that.
Well, there certainly are strains that attempt to understand this beauty and brutality, but I think even for most Americans, they have a really, even if they understand that there's beauty and brutality in American history, what they think generally is there's beauty in spite of brutality. But my argument is that the beauty of the United States was made possible by the brutality. We wouldn't have the democracy, the liberty, the equality if we hadn't also had genocide and enslavement, as well as perpetual war at the same time. And so I think that idea that the beauty and the brutality are inseparable is really difficult for even the most liberal Americans to comprehend. And you have to understand what else was happening recently. It was the opening of the Obama Center in the United States as well. Now, if you're a good liberal American, you celebrate that. You're like, oh my God, President Obama is one of the greatest presidents we've ever had. And look at this, library or center that he has built. But when we look at that, what we have to understand is that this is not a bipartisan issue where the Republicans or the conservatives are somehow on the side of American imperialism and the Democrats and liberals are anti-imperial. I mean, in actuality, American imperialism is bipartisan. Democratic presidents have been just as invested in American imperialism as Republican presidents. And President Obama, in as much as he has symbolized hope and beauty, was also a president that did many things that advanced American imperialism, including things like drone strikes, which are now part and parcel of how imperial power is exercised both by conservatives in the United States, but also by the people we support, like Israel as well.
In fact, the drone program started very early in his first term, before he got the Nobel Peace Prize.
And the fact that you can be an American president who kills people and gets the Nobel Peace Prize is a perfect symbol for the Orwellian politics in which we're living, including, of course, again, I'm just going to return to the question of Israel and what it's done in Gaza and that genocide there, that the rhetoric of peace and equality and democracy is being used to mask genocidal policies. And the United States has been completely complicit in that, both in terms of Israel, but also in terms of its conduct in many other circumstances as well.
We will talk a lot more, I hope, about your engagement as an activist on the issue of Gaza, I hope, in a few moments. But I want to focus a little, if we can, on your memoir. It strikes me that you're quite a reluctant memoirist, and the book, which is called A Man of Two Faces, is also called A Memoir, a History, a Memorial. And that, just the title, makes me think, here's a man who isn't entirely at ease writing a memoir. I wonder if you will explain to us when you first felt that tension of being born in Vietnam and made in America. At what point can you remember that tension first began to percolate in your mind?
Well, it's true. I'm an unenthusiastic memoirist, and if you ever meet an enthusiastic memoirist, you should run in the other direction because those people are really weird. I think if you ever have the material to write a memoir, it means you've been badly damaged in some way, and you should be grappling ethically with what that means to be talking about the damage. Because in order to talk honestly about the damage that leads to your memoir, you have to be absolutely honest, whether it's in terms of the nations that have produced the trauma or your own family. And so writing a memoir, I think, is always about taking on this difficult relationship to truth and betrayal. Because you do have to betray people and you do have to betray your communities in order to write this honest memoir. For me, I think one of the reasons why I had such difficulty writing the memoir, in addition to the act of betrayal, was because memoirs are oftentimes so individualistic. And for me to talk about my own family and myself, I have to understand that it's not simply an individual story, it's a collective story. So I do talk about my parents and what they've been through. And of course, when we write about our parents, oftentimes we want to celebrate what they've been through and treat them as really exceptional types of people. And that was true for my parents, but I also felt that what they had been through was completely normal. So for many Americans, if you're a refugee and you tell them what you've been through as a refugee, the reaction of many Americans is like, wow, we can't believe you've been through all these horrible things. But I grew up in a Vietnamese refugee community where everybody had been through these horrible things. And even though, each of those tragedies was terrible for us individually, it was so normal at the same time. And so I think that was the first problem of writing the memoir, was to think about the fact that what my family had been through was completely unexceptional, even if it was extraordinary for a lot of Americans. And so to be born in Vietnam and made in America, that trajectory is a trajectory of collective trauma and collective experience, which when you arrive in the United States, it's treated as an individual story. And so, for example, recently, and this is not my idea, I was included in a list by Forbes magazine. I don't know how many of you know what Forbes magazine is, but Forbes magazine in the United States is a magazine for the rich and the powerful. And Forbes magazine decided to create a list of the 250 greatest self-made Americans, in which I was included. I have a lot of problems with being included on a list of self-made Americans because I don't think there's any American that's ever been self-made. we might have made something out of ourselves, but only because of collective conditions of possibility. The only thing I liked about that list was that I was between Cardi B and Venus Williams. That's a list of honor. I'm glad to be there. But the idea of the self-made American, this is how someone from Vietnam who was born in Vietnam but made in America, this is how we're understood. That we don't want to talk about the trauma and the war. We want to talk about how you became a self-made American from being a refugee. And so I knew that if I was writing that kind of a memoir, I would just have such an audience, but this is not what the book is about.
Well, it isn't what the book's about, and as you've alluded to, it very much is as much your parents' story as it is your story. And as you say, that also reflects a collective story of thousands and thousands of Vietnamese refugees who ended up in the United States. I want to go back a little bit, though, because your first novel, which I guess started you on the journey to end up on the Forbes list in some ways, The Sympathizer, which won the Pulitzer Prize in, I think, 2016. The title of that book has in it, so the title is The Sympathizer, but the first line from that book is reflected in your memoir. So the first line of that book is, "I am a spy, a sleeper, a spook, a man of two faces." And I wonder if you will talk a little bit about the kind of clearly deliberate attempt to make a connection between the doubleness that exists throughout the novel and the doubleness that you reflect on in A Man of Two Faces.
So, I mean, for those who don't know, The Sympathizer is about a mixed race French and Vietnamese communist spy. And when you're a spy, of course, you have to be a person of two faces, at least. You're always experiencing duality. And I think for people who are immigrants or refugees or who are otherwise classified as minorities in some way, relative to a dominant society, we often feel as if we are of two faces or of multiple personalities. We often feel that we are conducting acts of spying and espionage and subterfuge inside the nation that we're in. And so that's how I grew up. I grew up in the United States feeling as if I was always living at least a dual life. The life inside my family, the Vietnamese refugee community, where I was an American spying on these strange Vietnamese people. But the moment I stepped outside of that community, I was a Vietnamese person spying on Americans. And I think in order to survive in that kind of experience, you have to normalize that sense of duality. And that means that there's a lot of unprocessed confusion and trauma and so on relative to being a minority in the United States. And that makes for great emotional material for novels, for memoirs, and the like. And so for me to connect that to the experiences of a political spy, I think was really important, because my own experiences growing up with that sense of duality are actually pretty boring. But to project them into the body and the mind of a spy was, that was much more interesting.
I wonder if we can dwell a little on the trauma that you just spoke about, because in the memoir, there are there are many instances of trauma, not least the one right at the beginning of your life, where at the age of 4, when you became a refugee, you were then taken away from your parents. So that was the first kind of real memory that you have of your experience of living in, I think, a refugee camp in Pennsylvania. But the two other kind of really three actually shocking pieces of trauma are really to do with your parents being attacked in the United States, and also the decision that your parents made to leave their adopted daughter back in Vietnam. I wonder if you will just share a little of how you decided to treat that in the memoir, and what that meant for you, that kind of level of just dwelling on that and exposing that.
So I came to the United States at the age of 4. We ended up in this refugee camp in Pennsylvania. And in order to leave the refugee camps, Vietnamese refugees had to have an American willing to sponsor them. There was no American willing to sponsor all 4 of us, my parents, my brother, and me. So one sponsor took my parents, one sponsor took my 10-year-old brother, one sponsor took 4-year-old me. And so my earliest memories are of myself howling and screaming as I'm being taken away from my parents, which was being done for our own good, to allow my parents the time to find jobs and to take care of us. But when you're 4 years old, obviously you don't understand that. And so I didn't get to come home for about 3 months, but my brother, who was 10 years old, didn't get to come home for 2 years. And that, he likes to say, is how we know Mom and Dad love you more. But as always, for refugees, the experiences of trauma are connected to other things as well. So don't feel too sorry for my brother. 7 years later, after coming to the United States with no English, he graduated as the head of his high school and went to Harvard, which is what you're supposed to do when you're a refugee. And, you know, in my case, I didn't do that. I became a writer instead. And that is, my parents had no idea they were raising one of the most dangerous creatures you can find in your house, a writer. And then, you know, my parents opened a grocery store in which there was a typical refugee story. They worked there constantly. And like many other grocery store owners, they were attacked and shot in their store, in their case, on Christmas Eve. And I think we were very lucky, or my parents were very lucky, that these were only flesh wounds, because a day or two later, they were back in their store working again, because they had no other choice. If they weren't going to work, who else was going to take care of the store and the family? I don't know whatever other trauma, but I think when I was growing up, these elements of my life, our lives, seemed to me completely normal. And there was no time
including discovering that you had a sister.
Right. And there was no time to dwell on the past, because if we dwelt on the past, we would not be able to survive in this country. So we had to constantly look forward and not talk about the past. So one day when I was 11 or 12, a letter shows up in the mail. And in the letter is a picture of this beautiful young woman. And I asked my parents, who's that? And they said, that's your sister. And I did not know I had a sister. Now, when I was 4 years old, when I left the country, obviously I knew I had a sister, and then I completely forgot about her. And then this letter arrives with this picture. And of course, all these questions started to come into my mind about who was this person? Why did we leave her behind? And could I have been left behind? What was this absence in our family that was this living ghost in many ways? And I think that haunted me for a very long time. But what also struck me was that whenever I visited a Vietnamese refugee household, they all had black and white pictures of people who had been left behind. The parents, grandparents, children, siblings. And so this was absolutely a normal part of the Vietnamese refugee experience, that there were so many divided families. My wife's family, for example, by the time I met my wife, she had not seen her mother in more than 20 years. Her mother had been left behind. And her mother had just come over, and then my wife at 24 years of age was left to grapple with what that meant to not have had contact with her mother for 22 years. And so I think for so many of us who are refugees, who had been marked by these experiences of war and trauma, we all had to, in different ways, try to grapple with these experiences successfully or unsuccessfully. And this is one of the reasons why I felt that one of the lines I've written is that just because a war ends doesn't mean, just because a war has been declared to be over, doesn't mean a war is actually over. For so many people. There were so many refugees I knew whose lives were shaped by trauma, which they, in many cases, had not processed. And so they acted out on that trauma in different ways. And so that trauma was transferred to their children and to their grandchildren. And it wasn't just refugees. American soldiers who came and returned from the war, many of them never talked about their experiences. And so their children were left with these silences around which their entire lives were structured. And so even if trauma is not talked about, that trauma can still be passed on through silences and absences.
I mean, one of the things that seems to be a theme throughout what you have written is you use the word haunted a fair amount, and the idea of a ghost is completely present in a short story that you wrote in a collection called Refugees, which is so potent. I wonder if you'll just tell us a little bit about that story, because it's about the relationship between siblings, one who is dead who comes and finds the one who's alive.
So that story is called Black-Eyed Women. It's the first story in the Refugees. That story took me 17 years to write. It was an absolute misery. You can read it in 30 minutes. It's great. It's a great short story. And so the 17 years has no relationship to you reading the story, but I think it took me 17 years to write that story because I learned how to write short fiction through writing that story. But I think it also took me 17 years to write that story because I had to understand what the story was about. And in the end, it was a very simple story about a woman who is haunted by a ghost of her brother. They had both been on a refugee boat, and her brother did not survive the experience, and she did, in the sense of being able to make it to the United States. But when the ghost of her brother arrives, many years later, because it took him that long to swim across the ocean to find her, what she discovers is that she is actually not alive either. Even though she physically survived the passage on that boat, she was raped on that boat by the pirates, and she died on that boat too. And so that was using the form of the ghost as a genre in order to describe, I think, how so many people who have lived through war and refugee experience and sexual violence may be physically alive, but in many ways are dead in certain other aspects, and how they're haunted by the past and by the silences. And so I certainly experienced that both in terms of my life as an American and my life as an individual, because I think the United States, as with so many other countries, is haunted by its past and is haunted by the silences and absences of different experiences, whether that is genocide or enslavement or perpetual war, that so many Americans are not capable of talking about. And when we're not capable of talking about the traumas of our past, the traumas that we've inflicted on other people, the traumas that have been inflicted on us, we're going to repeat those traumas in the present, which is one reason why I think the United States is caught in a cycle of perpetual war and violence, both in terms of what we do to each other as Americans, but what we as Americans do to other countries. And I had to recognize that in myself as a person as well. So even as something as seemingly trivial as being separated from my parents when I was 4 years of age, which I thought was not a big deal, in fact was a big deal.
Yeah.
And I think for me, I had to put cement on that experience, not think about that experience, and to think that I was absolutely normal after being separated from my parents. And it took me decades and decades to realize that in fact what happened was incredibly traumatic, and that I was emotionally numb for many years of my life as a consequence of that. And I'm grateful to my wife, to my children, and to the difficulties in writing that forced me to excavate and to crack open that cement and to understand what was underneath.
Interesting you use the word crack open, because the memoir moves, I think, round about page 17, 18, you stop using the first person and you use the second person. And the rest of the memoir is you then did this, you then did that. And also there are, the way the memoir is laid out on the page, it's, set to the right, or there are small paragraphs set to the right, some left set to the left. And it seems to me that was also a very conscious decision on your part to try and get the reader to understand the fractured nature of not just the experience, but one's memory. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the unreliable memory that one has.
So the memoir has been called experimental, which is a term I completely reject.
That's fine.
Because
I don't think I called it experimental.
You didn't, but it has been called experimental, and I think there's nothing I do in the memoir that hasn't been done before.
Right.
But what strikes many people when they read it is there's a whole category in the United States, and maybe it exists in other countries too, of the ethnic memoir. And the ethnic memoir in the United States is very much the experience of the individual who's been traumatized somewhere else, and they come to the United States, they're further traumatized by the immigrant experience and the racial experience and the sexual experience, and then by the end, they're healed. They're healed to become completely functional Americans. That's the narrative of the ethnic memoir. And so that narrative, it requires a whole memory and a reconstruction of the self. And I felt that my relationship to memory was not whole in any way, shape, or form. My relationship to memory is that my memory is very fragmented and very episodic. And if I were to write this memoir as if it were, for example, Vladimir Nabokov's Speak Memory, which is a great memoir, and if you read it, it's amazing how much Nabokov is able to completely remember himself. That was not my experience at all. And so I wanted the form of the memoir to reflect and to express that sense of fragmentation. But the word that I would use instead of experimentation is playfulness, which is odd because there's so much trauma in the memoir. But at the same time, I think is actually, for the most part, I think it's very playful to read and to write up until the very last part, where we get into the fact that my mother went to a psychiatric facility. But it's playful because in writing that book, I had to be playful in order to be able to access all of these traumatic experiences as well.
Let's stay with the theme of memory, because you've also written about the war being, once the war is over, it's actually refought in terms of how it is remembered. And this appears not just in the Sympathizer, but it also appears in the memoir, as well as in essays that you have written. The influence of Hollywood in particular. talk to us about your first experience of just being a regular American teenager and watching what became a kind of spate of Hollywood films on Vietnam in the 1980s. Made a big impression on you.
So I've written that all wars are fought twice, the first time on the battlefield, the second time in memory. And that line comes about exactly as you said, growing up after the end of the American war in Vietnam, but then watching Americans fight their war all over again, in dozens and dozens of movies, and realizing that for Americans, the war was not over. And I grew up in a Vietnamese refugee community, and for us, the war was not over either. There was so much bitterness and anger and melancholy. And so I was very deeply curious about the past and how I had come into the United States. So I watched almost every movie that the United States made about its war in Vietnam, which is an exercise I recommend to nobody, especially if you're Vietnamese. So I'll just use one movie as an example, Apocalypse Now, which for our generation, Apocalypse Now was a movie that everybody watched,
Yep.
I think. And you didn't even have to be American. And you didn't even have to love America to watch this movie. No matter where I went, and I spoke to people about how I was researching the war in Vietnam, they would say, "Oh, have you watched Apocalypse Now?" I was interviewed in Italy by an Italian communist who was an anti-imperialist critic, and she loved Apocalypse Now. And I met an Indian critic of film who was also critical of American imperialism, and he loved Apocalypse Now. So for me, Apocalypse Now really symbolizes the power of American pop culture, that for so many people, you can be opposed to the United States politically, but you can still be seduced by American pop culture, by American soft power. And so I watched Apocalypse Now as this naive young Vietnamese refugee who wanted to understand his past, and as someone who was also an American who rooted for Americans when I watched American war movies. And I was rooting for the Americans in Apocalypse Now up until the moment they massacred Vietnamese civilians. And at that point, I was split in two. Was I the American doing the killing, or was I the Vietnamese being killed? And at 11 or 12 years of age, I had no way to make sense out of this experience. So I just did not think about it again until I went to university, and I was asked by a professor in a film class to recount a moment in a movie that was important to me. And the first scene that came to mind was that moment of the massacre in Apocalypse Now. And as I retold that story to the class, I found myself shaking with rage and anger. And at that moment, I realized that moment was actually traumatic. Not as traumatic as what my parents had gone through, but it was traumatic in its own way. And I think for so many of us who have been subjected to the symbolic violence of popular culture, that experience is actually really fundamentally shaping and distorting for so many of us. And I had grown up with this sense that stories had saved me. That's why I became a writer. I'd been seduced by the power of stories to take me out of my world and deliver me somewhere else. Stories could save me. But as I thought about Apocalypse Now and all the other movies that I'd been subjected to, I realized stories, if they have that power to save us, they also have the power to destroy us as well. And I understood at that moment that I had been destroyed by so many stories. And that was really the moment that convinced me that I could become a writer. Up until that moment, I thought if I were to become a writer, it would be to enact this more sentimental idea of salvation. But to realize that stories could save and destroy, that really revealed to me the complexity and the power of stories that I wanted to seize, and also revealed to me the way by which stories were powerful, not only through literature and movies, but through politics and culture as well, and that they were all one. And that was really an illuminating moment for me. And I thought, this is why I want to be a writer, to fight in that sense.
In 2022, I think you were invited by Harvard to deliver the very prestigious Norton Lectures. And I mean, I'm saying that because you've just said save and destroy. It then became a book called Save and Destroy. So these essays, these lectures that you gave are very much looking at the themes that have concerned you as both a public intellectual, an academic, and the duality of being an American and Vietnamese. I want to focus a little bit on one of the essays in this book, which will really take us to talking about your role as an activist, which has always been present. You were a prominent activist when you were a student. It kind of stopped you from studying in some ways. You were far more active on the campus than you were in the classroom. And I want to really ask you about the connection between the doubleness that you've talked about, the duality, the story saving and destroying you, and the relationship between Asian Americans and Palestine, because that is an essay that you have written about, which kind of outlines many things, not least the solidarity that is required by people who, even if they haven't experienced exactly the same thing, there are overlaps which make it possible for each of us to be in, I guess, solidarity and in embrace with people who are being oppressed and having violence wrought upon them. So I wonder if you'll just talk a little bit about that relationship between being Asian American and having solidarity with the people of Palestine.
Well, that topic is actually inseparable from getting invited to Harvard. So when I got invited to Harvard, I groaned inside. I was like, oh my God. I'm very skeptical about Harvard. I've described Harvard as a university that invented napalm. And I think that, I mean, I think the motto of Harvard is like light and truth or something of that sort. But, for me, like the light of truth is, that's the light of the Enlightenment, which is also the light that is made possible by slavery. The light of truth is made possible by the American imperial war machine that made me as a refugee come to the United States. So the ambivalence I've described in terms of saving and destroying in terms of storytelling is also the ambivalence of being someone like myself who is a quote unquote academic or intellectual whose place is found in these very elite institutions of publishing and academia and so on, in which we should feel ambivalent if we happen to be a refugee or a colonized person. And so I never take these invitations or these titles or whatever for granted, or I never take them without skepticism, because when it comes to something like Palestine, I had not planned to address that topic in my Harvard lectures, but October 7th happened while I was at Harvard, and I felt I had to immediately respond to that. And I thought about the fact that when I was a student, one of my first serious academic paper was actually using Edward Said's Orientalism to criticize Graham Greene's novel, The Quiet American, which is this very famous novel about the Americans going into Vietnam. And when I used Said in that fashion, I did not mention the fact that the Orientalism was born out of Said's own biography as a Palestinian intellectual. And when Said was talking about Orientals, what he was really thinking about at that time were Muslims and Arabs in relationship to France and England, which in what was then called the Near and Middle East. He was not really thinking so much about Southeast Asia or East Asia. But in the United States, his work has been completely appropriated by people like me to talk about Asians in the East and Southeast Asian sense, and it's been incredibly powerful for the way that I've understood Vietnam in the Western imagination. But for so many of us as Asian Americans, we have divorced Said's thinking and isolated Orientalism as somehow pertinent only to East and Southeast Asia. And that act, I think, is completely expressive of how colonialism has always acted to divide and to conquer. And to go back to Said, to go back to the question of Palestine, and to think about how what's happening in Gaza and what Israel has been doing in Gaza is actually completely connected to what the United States has historically done in so many other situations, was incredibly, I felt, necessary and powerful to do. Because I think for many people, for many Americans, and for possibly many other people in Western Europe, when we think about the question of Israel, it seems isolated, it seems separate from other acts of colonialism and genocide. But in fact, if we look at American history, it's completely connected. The genocide that the United States has been founded on, linked to the perpetual war that grew the boundaries of the United States ever westwards, took the United States across the Pacific to China. That was always the ambition. But the United States has always kept going beyond that. A direct line from the war in Vietnam to the United States' interest in the Middle East, to the United States' interest in supporting Israel, to the United States' interest in using Israel as a platform to continue to project American power in this region of the world. And so the American failure in Vietnam was completely addressed by the fact that the United States then started to support Israel as a way of affirming American power, and in a way that was redemptive, because the failure of the United States in Vietnam was somehow overshadowed later by the so-called success of Israel in conquering its region of the world. And so these elements of of power and domination, which many people would like to treat as separate, are actually completely connected. And so that was what the essay was about. It was both about forcing Asian Americans to see our connections to Palestine, because in some ways it is not a question about identity. It's not that we're all Asians in that sense, but the geographical region of Asia, which is completely incoherent, is something that the United States actually wants to dominate, from its furthest eastern edge to its furthest western edge in Palestine.
On a very personal level, you were very vocal, continue to be on social media about what Israel has been doing in Gaza. I wonder if you'll talk a little bit about the impact of that on you in the context of the kind of febrile atmosphere that existed in the United States immediately after October the 7th. What impact was there on you as an academic at Berkeley? Because you have now left, right? You're no longer...
I have resigned my professorship. I'm so happy. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll ask you why in a moment. But I wonder if you'll just talk a little bit about the impact on you as a writer, as an intellectual, as somebody who was willing to speak out. Because we know from, just it's still the case that anybody who speaks out is either targeted or is trolled or doxxed, or all kinds of things have happened to people who've spoken out. So what was your experience?
Well, I had gone to school at what I affectionately call the University of Communists at Berkeley. And I'd been arrested there as a student protester. And, I was involved in what were then called the culture wars, which were around diversity, equity, what we would now call diversity, equity, and inclusion, these words we can no longer say in the United States. And in some ways, that seemed to me actually very trivial at the time. It was important to me, but it seemed very trivial because earlier generations at Berkeley had fought against the war in Vietnam, had fought against imperialism, had fought against apartheid in South Africa. And here were we as young students in the early 1990s asking for more inclusion. And yet now we see that those culture wars are still here today in the United States, and that the culture wars are inseparable from the real wars that the United States are fighting. But from that period of the early 1990s up through the Obama administration and so on, if you were to speak out on diversity, equity, inclusion, if you were to talk about race or queerness or being, your gender, these things were never penalized in the United States. In our particular cultural world, those acts were rewarded. So it was very difficult to be silenced if you were speaking out on those kinds of politics. But if you spoke out on Palestine, if you spoke out on Israel, then you were penalized and then you were silenced. And so for me, it was not something that I deliberately sought out. I had signed on to BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, around 2015, 2016. And then the moment that October 7th happened, I think I immediately realized what was going to happen next, as so many people did, that the response was going to be so vastly disproportionate that by October 15th or 17th, I, along with 750 other writers and academics and artists from around the world, signed this letter acknowledging the tragedies and the human consequences that had just taken place, but also acknowledging that much worse was going to happen and that there should be a ceasefire. And on October 20th, I was supposed to give a talk at a place called the 92nd Street Y in New York City, which is a very important cultural institution, which is also a Jewish cultural institution, and that was canceled. And that became a controversy in the United States that is still unfolding today. But I think it's symbolic of a certain moment where it was required for writers and other kinds of artists in the United States to take a stand or not. And there's been so much silence on the part of so many writers and artists and intellectuals and academics who have been willing to speak out on so many different things, but not on the question of genocide in Gaza, because now there's a very clear red line about why that cannot be spoken about. And it is completely tied into the fact that the United States, as a military industrial complex that is still an imperial power, is completely capable of conducting genocide or supporting genocide. And that is a thing we're not allowed to speak about. And I rarely talk about it because I think the price I paid was very, very small compared to people who lost their jobs or people who had rewards revoked. So for example, I think the people who have paid the biggest price obviously have been Palestinians who have been bombed and terrorized in different ways, but also Palestinian writers and intellectuals who have been completely silenced as well. So I think for us who are not Palestinian, the least we can do is at least use the word genocide and to say it in public.
Let's open up questions from the floor. Please wait until there's a microphone in your hand, the lady here in the front, and then the hand just there.
I'm really interested in your process. At what stage do you know if like a piece you're working on is something for like a full book or going to be like a more journalistic piece that could be published elsewhere in magazine or on a media platform, for example?
I did too. Can you hold the microphone just a little bit closer?
Yes, I'm curious about your process of writing and when you know an idea is something that needs to be explored in a book form or as a shorter piece that might get published on a media platform, for example.
Oh, wow. I spent 17 years writing a short story collection, and it was awful and miserable. But the thing about those short stories is that I think that each of those short stories probably could have been expanded into something longer, into a novel, and vice versa. So I think the question of form is oftentimes really relative to the writer. Some writers can write very small. Some writers need to write very big. I'm actually one of those writers. And you, in a short story, can actually compress an entire universe into 15 or 20 pages, or you could do that in reverse. So it's actually very difficult to answer your question because I think it's so much of that is relative to your own personal inclinations as a writer. For me, I'm a maximalist. That's why it's so hard for me to compress ideas into 15 or 20 pages. And so for me, I'm always looking for ideas that I can expand out into a 200 or 300 page form. So it depends on the kind of artistic impact that you want to have with the story that you want to write. Sometimes less is more. That's why you want to write the short story. But for me, more is always better. And that's why I need to write the novel.
Have you got the microphone?
Thank you. Just want to say I was your fan. And as for the question, I was wondering about the writing process of the full novel, full book. How do you manage to keep the tone, to maintain it? Like, I'm sure there were some days when you felt extremely happy, the sun was shining brighter, and now you have to write about the characters dealing with the aftermath of someone's death.
No, that's a great question. So writers often talk about the voice and finding one's voice, and I think that's a very mystical concept, but it's actually true. And for me, I spent many decades trying to be a writer. There was basically 30 years of misery involved in trying to be a writer, which was partly about learning the various techniques of the art, but it was also about trying to find that voice, whatever that is. And each of us will take the appropriate amount of time to discover what our inner voice is. And for me, the voice is the sign of authenticity, that you've discovered what it is that is really you as a person, you as a writer, you've discovered your inner truth. And to discover your inner truth is actually really, really hard because society and your family and the publishing industry doesn't want your inner truth. They want the commodity that can be sold or the story that will not make them uncomfortable. But to access the inner truth is, in fact, I think, to make yourself uncomfortable because you have to discover what's inside of you that is something that you are having a hard time confronting. So that was one thing that was required in order to become a writer. But for the novel in particular, The Sympathizer, for example, the plotting was a difficult question, but the voice was actually the most important. I spent an entire summer working through different opening lines, different opening scenarios, and when I found the opening line that Razia quoted, "I'm a spy, a sleeper, a spook, a man of two faces," I realized that was the entire novel. So even though I had 400 more pages to write, that was the entire novel because in that line was the rhythm. And so writing fiction is obviously partly about characters and plots and things like that, but it's also about, as in your question, the tone, or what I would call the voice or the rhythm. Once I found that rhythm would drive the entire way that the novel was written. And so I spent a summer trying to find that opening sentence. And after I found that opening sentence, it only took 2 years to write the entire novel. So there's different ways, obviously, of trying to find that magic about how to write the novel. But for me, it was about just the rhythm of one sentence determined the rhythm of the entire novel.
I just want to chip in there because that opening sentence is so redolent of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which is obviously your opening sentences are a riff on that in some ways. And I wondered if you'd just quickly say something about the influence of people like Ellison and Toni Morrison and James Baldwin on your work.
Well, that influence of Black literature is incredible. But I think one way to also talk about this in response to your question of rhythm and tone and voice is that all of us who are writers are also readers as well. We've all spent decades reading many, many different kinds of things. And in reading different kinds of works, we absorb all of those works. That becomes part of our own internal universe. So when we try to find our own voice or our own rhythm, I think we're trying to find our own authenticity. But I think we're also trying to respond to everything that we've read as well. And so if we've absorbed a certain body of literature, that becomes a part of us. And sometimes it's academic. You have to think, well, I'm going to respond to these writers. But sometimes it's also a matter of those writers have now become a part of my own self. And so responding to them is a part of my own voice as well. So in this case, Black literature, specifically Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, that was something I'd read as a college student that I responded to very viscerally. Because even though Ralph Ellison was talking about being a Black man and how that experience was one of duality, of being invisible as a Black person until one is hyper visible as a Black person, I felt that model was also pretty descriptive of what immigrants and refugees and minorities experience in the United States as well. So he was one of many different kinds of writers I was trying to respond to in the novel as well.
The hand just there. Yep, you're turning around, but it's you I'm pointing to. Just here, in the front.
Hi, Viet. I read your Sympathizer and Refugee in 2015, amazing book. I really enjoyed it. Last year I was in New York, and one of the terms that I heard there was PEP, which stands for Progressive Accept Palestine. So how do you include those people in your storytelling, except for, I know you have been engaging a lot on Twitter, on articles and speeches, but do you also have you thought about writing to them or addressing them in a longer form? And another one was, you talk about duality a lot. Is there a nuance in that duality, or is it black and white duality? Thank you.
Those are great questions. And in fact, that allows me to talk about my next novel. So, I mean, I wrote The Sympathizer, and it was a novel that came completely out of my gut of trying to process everything that I've been describing. And it was also happened to be a novel that was about the Vietnam War. And in the United States, if you are a minority, you are allowed one trauma. And if you're Vietnamese, you're allowed the Vietnam War. So I knew when I wrote the novel that I had to write it because it was important to me. But I also knew that because I was Vietnamese writing about the Vietnam War, that would be the only thing people could talk about when that novel came out. Even though in my mind, it was obviously about the Vietnam War, but it was also about so many other things as well. And I felt that then I had to write a whole trilogy to explain that it was not only about the Vietnam War. So there is a sequel called The Committed, which is set in Paris of the 1980s, not Emily in Paris, but the Paris of refugees and immigrants, of the Algerians and the Arabs and the North Africans and the Black American expatriates and the refugees from Vietnam who had ended up there. And so it was important for me to write that novel because I wanted to demonstrate how what happened in Vietnam and Indochina could not be relegated purely to what happened because the United States was there, but because France was also involved as well. And so the third and final novel of the Sympathizer trilogy inexplicably opens in El Salvador of 1984. Now, why is that? It's because the moment that the Americans lost in Vietnam, they immediately turned to Central America. And the reason they turned to Central America is because Nicaragua had fallen to communism. And for Ronald Reagan, he saw Central America as the new front of the Cold War. So what would happen is that all of the violence and the bloodshed that the United States had extended to Indochina and Southeast Asia would be transferred immediately to Central America. And so for me, it was important to make that connection. And as I started to research and to write the novel, I also discovered that Israel was involved in Central America. Did you know this? Do people know that Israel was involved in Central America and Latin America? That the novel begins in El Salvador because I wanted to talk about the American role in Central America, and then I discovered that Israel had a role in Central America, that the United States stopped supplying weapons to El Salvador in the 1970s because of the human rights abuses of our Salvadoran allies, and Israel stepped in to supply 83% of the weaponry to El Salvador. Israel trained the Salvadoran military, trained the Salvadoran secret police, and these military and secret police did the things you would expect them to do in El Salvador. And Israel also trained Guatemala using the techniques that it had developed to suppress Palestinians. And the Guatemalan military and security apparatus used these Israeli techniques to conduct a genocide in Guatemala. And none of this was unique in Central and Latin America. So as I discovered that, I realized I have to actually incorporate this into the novel as well. So when you say progressive except for Palestine, the way that this translates into the literary world is, again, you can write about your own trauma, but you have to make sure you separate it from everybody else's trauma. Because if you can start connecting the historical experiences of different acts of domination, suppression, colonization, imperialism, what you realize is that the whole world is connected in this way. And so it is not an accident that Israel's techniques of suppression and genocide and containment and surveillance and all of these things have been exported to so many parts of the world and have gone hand in hand with American imperialism as well. And so in some senses, it was actually really sad for me to discover Israel's role in Central and Latin America, but as a novelist, I was thrilled. It's like, now I can incorporate this, and I'm sure it will be controversial that there will be a major character in this novel who is an Israeli, who is an arms trafficker and, Mossad agent who is deeply involved hand in hand with what the CIA was doing in El Salvador at that time.
Well, we can't wait. I've got 4 zeros staring at me, and we've kind of slightly gone over. So, but the great thing about Zeg is that you're going to be here still tomorrow, and people can carry on the conversation with you. But for now, Viet Thanh Nguyen, thank you
Thanks
so
much,
much.
Razia. Thank you, everybody. Thanks.